Welcome to the program. A real treat today. Irina Tsukerman is here. We are going to have an in-depth conversation about a lot. A lot of geopolitical issues, a lot of global issues, and the best part is how they all connect with each other. This is one of the smartest people that we have booked on this show, and we've got really, really smart people. That's part of the quest of this program, this community of curious minds, constantly looking for the best, the brightest, the smartest to help us make sense of the world around us and take us out of the daily headlines and think about the big trends. Well, there's few people better than Irina to help us do that. She is a human rights and national security lawyer who is also the editor in chief of the Washington Outsider and president of Scarab Rising, Inc., a graduate from Fordham University, where she earned a BA in International and Intercultural Studies and Middle East Studies in 2006, and the Fordham University School of Law, where she received a JD in 2009. Irina built a professional practice focused on relentlessly championing underreported international causes, especially through publications, media appearances, interviews, and organizing major international events. She is a prolific writer, with her work appearing regularly in the US, Europe, the Middle East, and a variety of international publications beyond. Interviews with her have appeared all over different cable and satellite news services around the world. She has presented to the United Nations and the UN Human Rights Commission on congressional panels at international conferences. She was part of the Muslim World League's second conference on cultural rapprochement between the USA and the Muslim world. And of course, she's participated in scholarly conferences as well. She is a well-read, well-informed, and thoughtful individual who has spent so much time helping others connect the dots on foreign policy, foreign affairs, big trends, current events, geopolitics, and gosh, there's so much happening in the world. So much of it seems connected, but talking to somebody who can actually help us think strategically and big picture about how all these parts and pieces actually come together, let's say, how they balance each other, how they all interact to create challenges for us as individuals, as countries, as communities. This is the biggest possible level of thinking that you can do. So I invite you to get yourself in the right mind space. Let's take off the glasses of daily news. Let's not worry about our phones giving us the latest breaking news alert out of somewhere in the world. Let's step back. Let's think big. Let's think about what every country is challenged with, both in their daily existence, but as they look over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And we're going to talk about a lot of those. And what I'm going to try to get at with Irina as well in this is a little bit about what the different players in the world are thinking as we go into the next decade and the next 20 years. And maybe some of this thinking will inform your own opinions about public policy in your country, or even your own feelings about what you might want to do to help, or what it means for your profession, or what it means for your company, or for your community. So, without any further hype, because I think this is an expert that in many ways towers above so many others, and her credentials speak for herself. But I also think that you're going to hear the way that she thinks, and hopefully you will find it as fascinating as I did. So, without any further delay, I present to you my conversation with Irina Tsukerman. Irina, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
So I just gave a brief introduction, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience in your own words, because I'm sure there's things I always miss. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you do for a living.
Sure. I was born in Ukraine. I came to the United States as a child. I grew up in New York. I studied international relations and Middle East and Latin America when I was in college. I went on to law school at Fordham Law School, where I focused on national security law, among other things. And after a few years of general practice, I moved specifically into the area of human rights and national security. I also tried my hand at being an analyst, and I've been writing for many years for a variety of publications. I've been commenting on domestic and international um, uh, media, and I've focused a lot of my work on issues pertaining to intersection of big tech and human rights and security issues, privacy versus security, energy issues and energy security, as well as more general issues addressing transnational issues and emerging threats as well, a lot on information warfare and how that pertains also to human rights and security concerns, how different states engage in those issues. So now I'm kind of wearing two hats as a lawyer with a niche practice in national security consultations and as a president of a strategic advisory company called Scarab, which provides services in geopolitical risk analysis, informational warfare, crisis communications, reputational management, and private intelligence gathering and analysis.
And you're also the editor in chief of the Washington Outsider and the host of the Washington Outsider Report. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the Washington Outsider emerged as a project of my company. This is a way for me to bring attention to issues that are frequently overlooked or not sufficiently covered or covered from a very US centric or particularly mainstream media centric perspective in the US. So I have invited diverse voices from all over the world to address issues that are important but that are rarely a center of attention here. The Washington Outsider Report serves similar purpose. It's a collaboration with a local radio station in Rhode Island, the Coalition Radio, and I have a video podcast there where each week I interview different personalities from various backgrounds. Some are U.S. based, and many are international to break through the Washington bubble of approaching policy and important issues, be they issues such as logistics and supply chain, science and technology, foreign policy, security, human rights or humanitarian laws. I try to provide different voices that are not frequently heard and also to provide a vigorous debate of perspectives from people who are also more mainstream.
So there's so much ground that we can cover. We only have 45 minutes or so today, so we're going to do the best we can. But let's start with this because you have such a diverse background and you're involved in so many areas of international affairs, foreign policy, national security. There are so many crises around the world, each one of which has its own unique dynamics. It feels like each one has the potential to explode into a larger conflict. From your view, what is the top national security concern that you're hearing about from your clients and you personally, as you look at the global picture today, as we record in December of 2023? What are, let's say, the top three international security concerns?
I would say the first one is the fact that we're facing actually a network of threats that are working closely together. Rather than viewing some of the major crises we're seeing today as separate, distinct issues, they should be viewed as part of the same network of threats who are collaborating among each other and who are taking advantage of this crisis as part of a major strategy to weaken US and its partners and allies. So as we are seeing the proliferation of crises in themselves are part of a strategy that follows an old Soviet paradigm of essentially creating five or six conflicts around the world that keeps Western countries distracted and splits priorities and weakens the hold. The war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the tensions between China and its neighbors in the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific, they are all part of this scheme, and the entities involved state entities such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, as well as non state entities such as Iranian proxies in the Middle East, Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist organizations and militia groups. They are all part of this paradigm. That's not to say that their goals are identical, but they share strategy, they share resources, and they certainly share a dedication towards both their own goals and anti-Western position in general. And their goal is to overwhelm the United States to take advantage of its vulnerabilities, such as domestic polarization, growing isolationism, as well as tactical issues and limitations ranging from supply chain weaknesses and logistical issues to weaknesses within the military apparatus to create an impossible scenario where there are multiple asymmetrical wars going on multiple fronts, and there's no clear way to prioritize any of them.
What would be your counsel on the way we as civilian participants and observers should think about these? And is there a prioritization? Should we be thinking about these conflicts with one being the beating heart of them all and the others being extensions? Help us think about this through the lens that you as a strategic consultant have to think about it.
I would be looking at the impact of these conflicts rather than the conflicts themselves, because starting a fight for the sake of starting a fight, that's not how these countries operate. They operate because they know that each of them will have significant implications for business, for economies, for security, for informational sphere, and for domestic political concerns. So these five different issues are all affected by all these crises. Of course, there are also smaller crises ongoing in Africa, which can grow into much bigger crises, but they are less of a priority because some of them are self-contained and unlikely to spill over in the near future, such as the Sudan war. Some of them are likely to spill over the future, but they haven't gotten there yet, such as the West African security concerns. But some of them, like the three crises that I mentioned, are already spilling over, and the spillover effect is something to watch over, and that is why it makes these three issues top priority, and they cannot be easily disentangled from one another. They have priorities for energy fields, all of them, all three. They have a priority um, for security issues because all three actors are involved in multidimensional hybrid warfare against Western states and not just their immediate neighbors. Russia has masterminded an effective information warfare strategy, exploiting the differences between its own closed domains and the relatively open Western information spheres. China has followed suit. There is a cyber dimension, there's certainly a political influence dimension. We are seeing, for instance, Europe being affected by political implications of this crisis. We are seeing different political actors coming to power in smaller European states. We are seeing how it's affecting bigger powers that are shifting their priorities or struggling to shift their priorities. And there's, of course, the dimension, the popular dimension, the exploitation of isolationist trends and different political polarized environments to create a sense of uncertainty, distrust in official institutions, and unwillingness to essentially listen to the formal messaging and rather listen to the messaging coming from these actors. Iran, by the way, is doing the same thing. It has mobilized not only social media accounts but also its networks of support from around the world to create the impression that the war in Gaza is something other than what it is, a specific deterrence response to October 7th attack that is threatening a potential escalation through a variety of seemingly unrelated proxy networks. It has mobilized groups on campuses. It has also been backing and funding community organizations in the West, unbeknownst to everyone, to create um, constant sense of local crisis with constant demonstrations and a sense of growing hostility and social and ethnic and religious polarization. So all of these things work hand in hand, and when they work simultaneously, when these networks are doing all of these things at the same time, it's very hard to keep track of them, but they impact every aspect of life, from the energy prices, which are to in general economic inflation, to geopolitical risk of investing in those regions or doing business in those regions or even having a physical presence in those regions, to political and security implications of having to figure out how to allocate resources towards self-defense and the defense of one's allies effectively, how to fight the wars without getting drawn into essentially scenarios where a country has no way out. How to do that in a way that is efficient and that will address these current threats. This is something we haven't quite figured out yet, but these are important things to think about in that framework. That we're not thinking about a bombardment of isolated threats, but rather it's a deliberate strategy that wants us to be overwhelmed, that wants us to understand that we should be looking at the allocation of resources in a systemic way rather than um, uh, one by one.
So as we think about the participants in that, we'll talk about the four that you mentioned: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea as state actors, and then
Mhm,
we know there are proxies involved. Can
mhm.
you walk us through, aside from the chaos that they're obviously sowing in the world and the challenge that they're presenting to the United States and the Western traditional post-World War II order, aside from just creating that chaos, what are their geopolitical and strategic goals? What is it that they're trying to accomplish through all of these means? Is it a national security concern? Are they trying to reshape the economic order of the world? What does success look like for them?
Long-term success for each country is the resurrection of their former empires in various forms, and these forms are now hybrid because the empire that China harkens back to, for instance, predates the Communist Party. Nevertheless, the Communist Party element is now present because that's who is in power now. So they're trying to combine their own political vision, that form that is very much state controlled and state driven, with this geopolitical ancient control of territories, a tributary system where China is the sole remaining superpower and where everyone else is essentially committed to following its lead in various forms, or in the case of smaller and weaker states, literally pay tribute to it directly and indirectly. In the case of Russia, it too combines two visions under a somewhat new form. The vision of the Russian Empire and the vision of the Soviet Union. These are combined both ideologically and in terms of territorial directions that Russia is currently pursuing. Nevertheless, if the common element that unites this vision is the fact that historically, throughout various iterations of Russia's history, power of the security apparatus was the one common thread, whether during the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet institutions. It was the security apparatus that actually drove these policies, and so the power of the security apparatus is actually the end goal, and everything else follows. With Iran, again, it relies on both Khomeini's dogma that has taken a particular form of Shia Islam to its conclusion in a very political and specific context, um, and it married it to empire interests of ancient Persia, which obviously predated Khomeinism, predated even Islam, and was back in the day Zoroastrian rather than Muslim. It has brought back these two visions of territorial control with its religious end, and the religious end for Iran is very, very specific. It seeks to take control of the two holy mosques in Saudi Arabia and become seen as the primary Muslim entity in the world, but also to restore its previous territorial control in order to colonize it the same way it has colonized certain territories under its current possessions, to take control of energy sources, metal sources, to subjugate these vast territories under the current existing regime in Tehran. Those are by and large those goals. North Korea is essentially, it's not yet quite as expansionist as the other three. It's more of a corollary that supplements them with assorted issues. It doesn't have the means to expand its influence geopolitically quite as much, but it certainly sees a potential control of South Korea as something within the radar, and then potentially even Japan. So some of its goals are actually linked to China's goals. Whether it has the same far-reaching vision is not yet clear, but they're certainly starting to go far beyond seeking to maintain control over its own position the way it is towards more global outreach. We're seeing it through cyber operations, through its expanding intelligence apparatus, and its increasing cooperation with the other three actors.
So we have a good sense there of what the official policy is of the governments, the political parties, or the authoritarian rulers of those governments. Do we have any sense if the populations of those countries share the same vision as their leaders? Or do you get the sense that there is a divide between what the leadership of these countries wants and the practical goals of the populations?
It's a mixture of both. First of all, in all of these states, it's incredibly hard to measure what anyone actually really thinks and feels about any of that. For reasons that none of these countries are democracies or liberal in any sense of the word. But it's also true that all four states have engaged in demagoguery and systematic indoctrination. Iran, of the four, had the greatest potential to have some sort of a more liberal element, simply because um, a lot of its older population has been uh, has been disillusioned with the way the state runs its affairs, and it has been disillusioned with the state use of religion. And been mass instability inside the country over the use of resources towards foreign campaigns and terrorism and militias, as opposed to reinvesting in the country's economy. But, and this is a big but, there's over 80 million people inside the country. They're ethnically and religiously diverse, and within those diverse elements, some are religiously conservatives, others are not. Some are politically conservative, others are not, and many of them despise the regime, but for very different reasons. For some people, economy is the biggest factor, and if it's ever fixed in the direction that benefits them, they will have no problem. Others are perfectly fine with the religious doctrine of the regime. Others are perfectly nobody's others are make do with the economy, but they are appalled at the religious doctrine of the regime. Not everyone is, and you have the younger generation, um, many of the millennial generations grew up with relative openness to the West, but the younger generations are growing up in an increasingly closed environment, with a surveillance state based on Chinese technologies, increasingly making it difficult to retain access to the outside world. And the Western education, just like in China and in Russia, now consequently being banned from where it was before. So we don't know what's going to happen, but if these trends continue, many of them are becoming isolated, self-isolating and increasingly anti-Western. And in the future, it could go much more so in that way, thanks to the provision of these technologies and this politics of self-isolation. In Russia, the population is extremely indoctrinated against the West due to mixture of media, state-controlled media, and various other factors, and the fact that basically the population is bombarded day and night with the state messaging from various angles. And a lot of the people who went to the West, they were part of the um, initially who had traveled to the West. They were part of the state-linked apparatus. They were not the average citizens who traveled to the U.S. And even those who did, they were. They were traveling to the West not for any political reasons, but for vacations, to meet families, and therefore that did not necessarily bring them towards a Western mindset. Having high exposure to the West does not guarantee a different political worldview. Same thing with China. They used to send a lot of students to educate in the West, but most of them came back to work with a higher social and economic status as a result of Western education, and not necessarily exposed to Western mindset beyond academic and business institutions. So just because these countries had a lot of exposure to the West does not mean that everyone there is pro-Western. You certainly have a high level of dissatisfaction with various aspects, with some of the power overreach by the institutions, with the economic concerns related to bad priorities by those states, but not necessarily pro-Western sympathies, especially given the level of political control. And North Korea is completely isolated, and there's a very high degree of pro-regime sympathy, even though many people are extremely poor and probably wish for a higher degree of exposure to the West. There's a general sense of wanting some of the Western things, like the better economies and better opportunities, without necessarily being sold on Western ethics and Western political structures.
So you've given us a very good view of what is happening on that side of the conflict. We'll call it China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and their proxies. Now let's take a moment to look at the opposing viewpoints from
Mhm,
Western European nations, Western cultured countries, and the United States and Canada. It certainly feels, again, as an observer, that if there is a synergy between the countries we just mentioned, there seems to be some divergence on the other side. That in principle, there's a lot of statements of support and actual financial and military support to countries like Ukraine and Israel and others who are under threat. And yet, we hear all the time about dissenting views on some of those conflicts, certainly the US's involvement in them. And we also hear about a debate about whether they should be looked at together. Here in the United States, as we record in December of 2023, there's even a hot debate in our Congress about splitting aid from Ukraine and Israel and taking the two issues separately. So, as you look at all of the countries who are on the other side of this conflict,
mhm.
and we have more insight into their population and their politics because of their democratic norms, how are you thinking about and how are you advising your clients to think about the Western response? Because it feels at times to be unified, and then at other times it feels like countries going in different directions.
Well, that's natural because, unlike dictatorships, Western countries have a high degree of social and political and economic pluralism, diverse internal interests, and essentially, of course, and separate national goals. Because, unlike states driven by imperialist ambitions, most Western states are driven by nationalist or regional ambitions, uh, and not a single-minded goal towards getting everyone to think exactly the same way. Uh, so of course there's going to be high degree of divergence. This is what the dictatorships try to take advantage of in conflicts. But despite all of these issues, first of all, necessity often ends up driving policies even after long periods of instability, polarization, and indecision. So, like it or not, a lot of the states end up coming to the fold more or less enough to make concerted decisions when they realize it's simply in their interest to not be taken over by dictatorial powers, which is the alternative to cooperating, at least on some level. It it is not a smooth pathway. It's much harder than for the dictatorships that are often driven by one man policies, where there's no need to try to reach a domestic, much less external political consensus. But nevertheless, despite this being a very messy process, they usually come to a conclusion that in general terms it's better to cooperate against the common enemy and to meet those challenges. Usually it's quite belated, but the advantage of these states is because of their openness. They are also open to exchange of ideas, to they're more open to information that contradicts their views, and the more this political liberalism, I'm talking about in a classical term, not any particular political position, is strengthened, the better they're equipped to stand up to close-minded authoritarian regimes, where there is a very much a negative attitude towards alternative information, which eventually leads these states into bad decision making, into traps, and lack of political and structural innovation. So at the end of the day, despite all the short-term disadvantages of having to fight over every little thing, um, I'd say Western states are actually better equipped to stand up to authoritarian regimes. The problem is not that they're too open, but that actually in some ways they're not open enough. There are authoritarian social trends on both sides of the political aisle pervading many of these countries. This polarization leads to entrenchment in one's positions, lack of openness to alternative points of views, lack of social debate except within these echo chambers, and that actually makes it more difficult to recognize external threats.
So let's talk about that particular issue as it pertains to Western governments and democratic societies, which is the information warfare that gets waged well outside the battlefields of Eastern Europe, of the Middle East, or anywhere else in the world. It certainly feels like social media has given a new weapon to those who choose to sow discord. But in other ways, we don't want to shut that down, nor do we want to restrict the access to free views. But we can see that it has radicalized some people in Western Europe, in the United States, and other countries. So, what is the, I don't know if solution is too strong of a word, what is the appropriate response when you have technologies that allow for misinformation, disinformation to travel so quickly that truth has a hard time keeping up with it. And yet we want to abide by our heritage and our legacy of both free speech and an open internet.
Well, I don't believe that these echo chamber networks are a cause of radicalization. I think they're a force multiplier. I think if someone already has an inclination to kind of stay with their own political tribe, it will certainly feed and entrench their positions more. But I don't think it causes close-mindedness or inability to hear others. I think it just enhances trends that are already there. And I think the solution to that starts outside social media. It starts in the real world. The problem why people fall into those traps, to begin with, why they're not open to alternative points of views, starts with lack of critical thinking and starts with lack of tools to resolve issues that are resolvable beyond self-isolating with the groups of like-minded. Uh, for instance, the issue of government distrust. It's an issue that is solvable outside social media. You don't need Twitter, X, Facebook to solve, Meta, whatever, to solve issues with the government distrust. You need the government to behave better. You need them to reassess what they've done wrong, to lose that trust to begin with, and to start taking steps towards restoring it. And then at that point it will be very difficult for the social media apparatus to do anything. Social media feeds on disagreements, on boosting controversy and boosting these echo chambers. That's how they're structurally designed. There may be hopefully at some point an incentive towards better social media that fuels cooperation and a better exchange of ideas and boosts better ideas rather than troll groups or or issues that are likely to spark a, um, heated attacks. But until that happens, we have to think of social media as tools, but not ends in themselves. So there is also a huge there is also, we have to look at it in retrospect. Different social media has different impact and reach. X is primarily aimed aimed at influencers, at journalists, politicians, and people generally highly involved in political discussions. Most Americans are not on X, they don't tweet. This is not where most of them are located. However, in Gulf states, that is the form of discourse that's most socially popular. Of course, we cannot control what happens in other countries, but we can study what the Americans, for instance, or Europeans are doing, where they're mostly reachable, and how to, and what we can learn from that form of messaging. By contrast, at least a third of Americans is on TikTok, and TikTok is arguably um, a state-controlled or a state-linked media linked to China. It goes far beyond the general gathering of information that most networks do, in that it also takes biometrical information and keystrokes, and it provides a different form of discourse for the outside world versus mainland China, and it's I guess close allies and networks. So what people are seeing in China on TikTok is not the same as what is being aimed at the West, and there is an information warfare component to the way those apps are used. They deliberately enhance political issues that China perceives to be in interest. For instance, they've been boosting Hamas propaganda. They're also aiming different strategies to kind of aimed at young people, young influencers, and just impressionable people in the US, such as all these TikTok challenges that defy common sense and yet have undertaken a life of their own. That is a deliberate, it's weaponization of entertainment, of social media component, to kind of weaken young people and to weaken the state. And it's also creates this cycle where it gathers information and then it designs content aimed at particular people to kind of get them involved even more. It's essentially it uses this biometrical data to target people physically, to identify them, and to become to help target them future for in the future for intelligence agencies. In my opinion, TikTok has no redeeming value in the West. It may have a redeeming value in China because it has a different purpose there, but outside the West, it is not the same as any as other social media companies. It's not just a mere exchange of ideas where anything can happen. It's a deliberate information weapon. I don't think it should be allowed. I think it's a mistake to let young people under 18 on it at all, and I really don't think it should be anything worth supporting. And to those who claim that they've taken jobs with TikTok, I think the market will provide a very clear solution to this space, as it has in India, where an American company, Snapchat, very quickly took over the market after TikTok was banned there, and they are growing quite broadly and providing the same types of services that made TikTok popular in India to begin with. So social media can have different roles, but it's important to look at what they actually are, and it's important to provide tools to the population from very young age to be able to think critically, to assess information, and to be able to ask questions and to look beyond one source of information, and basically breed intellectual curiosity. This is not a very satisfying answer, but it's the only answer because nothing else really works. You can try to put there's been various pathways of working with these social media companies, but at the end of the day, if people choose to self-isolate, this is going to go beyond social media. Some people who self-isolate aren't even on social media, but they are there because they join cliques and mobs, echo chambers because that's who they are surrounded by, and because they're not equipped to uh, ask questions about it. It's comforting, it's easier. So I think it's more important to understand what people are getting out of this than what actually um than whether or not than going after social media and trying to put an end to it. I think at the end of the day, many people end up being disillusioned with social media and the way things are, and they leave it and they don't come back necessarily, but that still doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Yeah, there's always new customers. For everyone that leaves, there's five more that join, right? Okay, so let's take a moment now to talk about a different part of the world that we haven't covered yet. And you mentioned it there in the conversation around TikTok, and that's India, which, for whatever reason, doesn't get as much attention in the United States, at least, as many of the other countries of the world. Even though it is an enormously populous nation, we have a large number of Indian Americans living in the U.S. who were born in India and have a great
Mhm.
interest in that country and their long term goals. And we know that they have been viewed by the United States and others as a bit of a counterweight to countries like China, who they border and have their own geopolitical challenges with. When you think about India and where they are in the geopolitical space, the global economy, do you see them as a rising country that will at some point be a peer to those that we've already been talking about? Or do you see that there are challenges in India that the West may have to deal with, maybe not as confrontational as China and Russia, but because of their own goals and their own ambitions, they may end up clashing with some of those traditional Western powers?
I think it's possible. I think we're a long way from a major clash, simply because um, for India even to choose a particular direction, you have to understand that it's with the over a billion, nearly a billion and a half of population, choosing direction in itself is a challenge. So before we even think about long-term goals, we have to deal with the reality that right now there's a lot going on there simultaneously, and if you want to make sure that it doesn't get to the point where there is a potential clash of goals, we should be having a much closer relations, and we should be taking the time to understand what the current dynamics are and where it's all headed. By and large, and to generalize, the general direction is very nationalist, not in a territorial way, but in a way of uh, self image being extremely important. And there's a very strong anti colonialist move. And you would think, well, it hasn't been colonized in decades, but that's not how people generally see it. They feel that the influence of the some of the Western countries, in particular Britain, has kept India as being seen as a kind of this backward country for a long time. They're struggling to overcome this image, and if we want to be helpful, we need to make sure that it takes a healthy direction, a healthy nationalism, as opposed to an attempt to compensate for previous wrongs by going too much in the other direction. And there's a scandal brewing right now over between the U.S. and India over a failed plot to assassinate a Khalistani extremist who is a U.S. and Canadian double dual citizen. Now, the core of the problem there is, of course, actually lies with a significant communication divide between India and U.S. Whereas in the U.S., if you to recognize someone as an extremist, to designate them as a terrorist, you need to engage in this long process of lobbying and providing information. And um, India felt that their warnings were not taken seriously enough in private government discussions, and therefore this individual and his network presented a direct threat. And to be honest, they were not entirely wrong, because following that chain of events, that person came out publicly and threatened to blow up an airplane. And similar incidents have in fact occurred in Canada in the past. So it's not that their perception is completely warped, but that they don't also understand the climate, the political climate in the U.S. And in order to extradite someone, to arrest, or even to investigate someone, there needs to be a lot of public awareness of why that person or network are actually a threat, and that completely failed. So to prevent future incidents of that sort, and nobody welcomes assassinations on their own land, including their citizens, no matter how extremists, and India wouldn't either, there needs to be some sort of a process to kind of figure out how these exchanges of ideas can take a more of a daylight, public daylight, and they can be aired in public long before it comes to the point of this level of miscommunication that leads to such incidents, and has a potential to damage relations. There needs to be a huge level of engagement between the US institutions and Indian institutions, communications, best practices, exchanges of ideas on all levels, not just business ideas, but security, law enforcement, um, institution building, all these basic social needs, media, journalism, they need to be integrated more. If we want to have an ally, if we want to have a counterweight to China, we can't just let the country be loose on its own and then expect them to kind of do what we want from them. For us to be on the same page, it requires a very significant level of engagement, and I'm just not seeing nearly enough of it. It's improving from nearly zero. It's gotten to some economic and business and security exchanges, but I still see that, on the other hand, that just as India took for granted that its security concerns should be addressed immediately without all the work that should be put into it, US is actually making the same mistake on its own end. It believes that India, oh well, they have tensions with China, so they have to be pro us and do things the American way, which is also not the case at all. They have their own culture, they have their own internal dynamics that we need to understand before we figure out how we can cooperate and what makes sense. But what we cannot do is take for granted that everybody who has a common enemy with us will operate exactly within our own framework.
Right. Let's talk for a moment about the emergence of artificial intelligence, machine learning, generative AI, and
Mhm.
the implications that may have on international affairs. It's a huge topic, so we don't have time to cover all of it. Let's focus on the national security portion of this. You certainly read about and you hear about countries that are experimenting in this space, that are looking for an advantage, looking for an edge. You, as a consultant and looking at this from the point of view of an expert, where do you think the most practical implications of this technology are likely to be, let's say over the next couple of years, whether in relation to the big conflicts we've been talking about or perhaps on a smaller scale? What concerns you? What are you advising your clients on this topic?
So AI could be, as any tool whatsoever, can be used in a positive or negative way. So all depends on who is controlling it. So far, the biggest applications now are related to identification, surveillance, and sort of information sphere, to put it more broadly. There's also an aspect related to weapons, having AI driven weapons, but that is less an issue of more ethical dilemmas than technical enhancement. But where the ethical elements come in are the information sphere, arguments about deepfakes, surveillance, how far can you go, and who should benefit from that. And quite ironically, by the way, one thing I noted, that the people who are most frequently found talking about uncovering deepfakes and what dangers and challenges they present for law enforcement, they some of the ones are the ones who actually create those very structures. And one of the problems is not that they exist, because technology, it's like with anything else, technology is going to be uh, chasing after results on both sides to create and then to uncover. But the fact that very often, especially government structures, rely on the very same people who are behind these damaging um, impact technologies, sometimes knowingly because they are the best at what they do, and sometimes unknowingly because they don't realize it's the same people who are causing the problem to begin with. So we're kind of stuck on a cycle without this superiority edge to the side that is trying to keep the information sphere from being dominated by malicious motivated actors. and I feel like they have currently an edge in terms of the fact that they have much more awareness than the other side that is struggling to keep up with all of this. In terms of surveillance implications, there's been a heated debate in the US domestic circles about facial recognition systems. Because on the one hand, it's a powerful tool in crime prevention and detection, and also in terms of finding people who are lost, who are, or in, in any form of beneficial sphere where you need to locate somebody quickly. But on the other hand, there's a potential for abuse. Not always abuse, by the way, by the law enforcement, but by social institutions who can use facial recognition to discriminate against people they don't like on any basis, even just a personal conflict. There was an incident when the facial recognition was installed in a building. I forgot what it was, a theater or a venue of some sort. And the owner of the venue had a conflict with some particular individual, used the facial recognition to block them from entry for no particular reason. And that caused a great deal of debate. So, who gets to control this? Under what circumstances can you use these systems to guide your decision making? Should they be? What should be the regulatory framework for them? Those are all major questions, but the bottom line is, anything that can be um, helpful can also be misused, and vice versa. Some of these powerful tools that are being used by malicious actors, they are also powerful tools to prevent real threats, security threats. Surveillance spyware can be used against dissidents, but it can also be used against terrorists. So it all depends who gets to control it, and is there a regulatory framework to make sure that it doesn't get abused, that it's used only in extreme cases. And the best spyware you will find, it does have that framework, and it's highly regulated. It's not easy to use, and it requires a framework to regulate. The worst spyware is going to be um, imitation copies of the powerful tools that are free floating on the market, that may have been re-engineered by people looking to make a quick buck with no concern for ends up happening. So um a lot of it just really depends on who is in control and what motivates them and how they present it.
So you have about as big of a view of the international picture as anyone. We've talked about a lot of what makes the news. I'm sure there are dozens and dozens of big topics and trends that don't make the news every day that you keep an eye on because you see them as a potential expansion of the conflicts that we've been talking about earlier. What is it that's not making the news today that we should be keeping an eye on or educating ourselves about?
Well, number one issue is the abuse of the migration factor by malicious state actors, specifically to create security challenges and to advance their own goals. That is for sure true in Europe, where we have seen Russia actually attempt to abuse the use of migrants to flood European countries with them, like Finland. Most recently, Turkey has done something similar in the past, during at the height of the Syrian war. They have literally used migration frameworks to demand political and financial concessions from the European Unions in exchange for not flooding them with unvetted migrants. The same could potentially happen during the crisis here in the U.S. with the southern border. So far, the problems have not been linked to any particular state actor. We have seen extremist groups, criminals, and so forth, trying to make their way in. And the biggest issue has not been with the human flow in terms of state actor linkage, but with the fentanyl flow through the borders. And there's also been a lot of human trafficking, but again, that's not necessarily linked to state actors, but rather to cartels and criminal organizations. However, it is entirely possible that the state actors have been weaponizing this security vulnerability for their own ends, simply to threaten the U.S. To bring in um, groups of people to destabilize the country to create a political issue, or in the future they can actually control the flow of migrants into the US and basically threaten to unleash that flow and to overwhelm the borders in exchange for political concessions. And by the way, it's I would think of not so much Latin American countries as the biggest potential culprit in that regard, but China. To the extent Latin American countries have been involved in something similar, it was actually mostly self-serving. They have a few countries like Nicaragua have literally emptied their prisons of low-level offenders, and a lot of these people made their ways to the borders, which those countries knew was going to happen. But it is still not quite the same as potential weaponization of groups of people to literally overwhelm the system and make it impossible to keep allocate resources effectively. So China is one potential actor. Russia has also been um, uh, uh, maybe looking to weaponize the sort of flow of people not wanting to serve in the military towards that end. Some of them, a lot of them, have been making their way to the U.S., but still it's less of an issue because some of them actually end up getting visas. Um, so I would very much look towards that potential trend. And on the other hand, the same migratory framework, I would look at what's happening in West and East Africa. There's a convergence of terrorist threats along with local sectarian and political conflicts that threatens to essentially leads to major refugee crisis, and with that also a potential for international jihadist groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS to take advantage and also to end up flowing from African states that are destabilized into Europe. A lot of people have written about those prospects for years, but the situation, far from being handled better, is actually getting worse. France that had played a security role in West Africa has been largely kicked out. China is seeking to replace its Western states as an influence in Africa, but more on kind of self-serving economic issues than security issues. And Russia's Wagner, has been not helpful at all. They cannot stand up to the terrorist groups. They simply do not have those capabilities, and all they do is prop up, coup juntas and the like. So they're not really an answer to the potential security crisis that can emerge and can impact the world. And Africa, by the way, is also becoming much more of a quantity in the security sphere due to the rich allocation of natural resources needed for the energy security, for electrification processes, for climate change related projects, energy transition, and the like. China is very much in that game. It's kind of trying to control the flow of access to these resources. So if the continent is destabilized from both directions, as is becoming very much a trend right now, it can lead to a huge energy crisis component and a huge conflict that is very hard to predict at this point, because the US and most Western countries are not all that involved there, and with China being the biggest player, it's very hard to see how it's all going to end, but it's not a good combination.
It has been a fascinating hour of conversation. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. If folks would like to learn more about you, your consultancy, or your work, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you and to follow along?
I am very much active on LinkedIn and on Facebook. I also have emails attached to Scarab Rising website where I can be reached at any time. Um, and of course, I am quite active on the Washington Outsider and the Washington Outsider Report, and have the Substack for the Washington Outsider with my media appearances in and commentary. My newsletter is published there, and you can sign up for it as well.
Excellent. And we will post links to all of that in the description of this show. Irina, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing the show.
All right, that was a lot to take in. I'll be honest with you. That was a tough interview to prepare for because when you're talking to somebody like Irina who has such a vast knowledge, you want to make good use of their time, and there's more topics than you could possibly cover in an almost hour long interview. But I hope we did it justice. We will almost certainly have Irina back, because the one thing about geopolitics and the world affairs and public policy around the world is it's constantly changing. I mean, imagine if we'd have had that conversation on October 1st of 2023, before the attacks on Israel on October 7th of that year, which precipitated the mass conflict that Israel then, in retaliation in Gaza, and then all of the actions that took place uh, in the weeks and months that followed that. I mean, that's how quickly geopolitics can change. That is how quickly an issue like Ukraine goes from the front page to the second page, fairly or unfairly. It just does. And that is how quickly a conflict that started a couple of years ago in eastern Ukraine can now have tentacles literally grasping at every area of public policy all over the world a couple of years later, and becoming intertwined with other conflicts, even as there's an interconnectedness between them. There's so many parts of that show I would encourage you to go back and listen to again. But if there's two big takeaways that I will just emphasize to make sure you didn't miss them, and to encourage you to go back and listen to these segments if you did. Number one, most international affairs, most big issues taking place around the world are interconnected. Now, I think most of my listeners in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, um, the Australasian countries, I think most of you understand the interconnected nature of issues, because so many countries in that part of the world are so close to each other. Everything is interconnected. But for my listeners in North America, it can be isolating sometimes, living in the United States and having friends and colleagues in Canada or Mexico or some of our Caribbean islands. It's just different here. We don't feel as interconnected. These huge land masses with one government, even if we have differences between states, we still live under, one basic governance model, and we think of ourselves as a bit on an island, and it feels like sometimes we're on an island. But understand that hardly anybody else in the world sees it that way. And I think it's very interesting to me that a conflict like what we see in Ukraine, a conflict in the Middle East, multiple conflicts in the Middle East, um, saber rattling in the East Asian theater, where China has obviously feelings and ambitions, and even a country like North Korea, understanding how all of these are actually part of one big alliance of sorts, even if it's an alliance of convenience. It's a counterweight to the United States. It's a counterweight to the Western order, the Western world. It's a counterweight to the norms that so many of us listen to this program, who value things like free speech, where podcasts like this can be published without fear of retribution from a government. We have taken so much of that world for granted. Just understand, as one of the key takeaways, that there is not just one nation, not just two nations, and not just a couple of backwater countries, but big, powerful, wealthy nations who have an alternative view for the future of the world that might look a little more like its past, with a more imperial view and a lot less freedom for individuals. That's an important takeaway, that this isn't just one or two belligerent actors. This is a network of state and non-state actors who have a different view of the world and would like to bring that view of the world to life. And it's not one that most of the people listening to this program would recognize or want to be a part of. The second thing I think is important is we have had conversations in recent episodes on an issue that is talked about here in the US a lot, which is migrants and migrant rights. But you heard in this program towards the end, Irina pointed out that, That is an issue that is happening all over the world, and don't think that it's not connected. Don't think that there aren't players around the world who see this as an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity for someone. And so, as we debate those issues, as we think about them ourselves for our own communities, let's think about them also in the broader sense of how America's enemies, Canada's enemies, the UK's enemies, how nations around the world think about weaponizing this topic that we may see as an inconvenience or a human rights issue, but it actually can very easily become a national security issue, and it may be viewed that way by a great many nations as it is today. And look, this is not an exclusive podcast. We certainly hope that there are those listening to this program in some of the countries that were mentioned. I certainly hope there are some listeners who get this in Russia. I hope there are some Chinese listeners. I hope we do get some folks in Iran who listen to this program. I would hope that there's open conversation among some about some of the topics. Very few of the things we talked about today are all that controversial or should be censored by any government. Um, and I know that there are some living in those places who have a different take on these. I encourage you to listen with an open mind and open heart, just as I ask all of my other listeners around the world. We're not here to point fingers or point blame. This is a program about trends and about topics that everybody needs to be aware of and to understand. And so you are welcome to participate in this community of curious minds as well. It is about curiosity, it is about asking questions. So as long as you are somebody that adheres to that and you come to this program seeking answers as we all do, and you're curious about what others have to say, you and everybody else are more than welcome to participate in these dialogues and this conversation. So, in the spirit of that, we will take a turn next week to a different topic: exercise. How about that for a transition? Grace McNamara joins us in our next episode. She is the CEO of Exercise Intelligence, and she has developed a digital therapeutic, an actually approved digital therapeutic that basically uses exercise to help treat any number of ailments that you may be afflicted by. And look, you always are told how important exercise is, but next week, Grace is going to actually tell you the scientific benefits of those and some of the great benefits that you can receive by having tailored programs that are personalized, where you're incentivized and monitored with the support and help of your physicians to help you meet the health goals that you seek. Should be a great episode next week and a great conversation. The home of this podcast remains brianjmatos.com. Visit that website to find all of our interviews from all of the shows that we have done. And you can find previews of upcoming programs as well. You can also find our show notes and links to subscribe to this podcast anywhere, truly anywhere that you get your podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, a Player FM, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts, you can find this show and subscribe to it. I invite you to do so. You can also find clips of this program on YouTube, and you can find me on any of your favorite social media sites. All of those links are available on my website, where you can just search Brian J. Matos podcast on any of your favorite social platforms and find us there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of the Brian J. Matos podcast and for being part of this growing global community of curious minds. Until our next episode, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.